Committee should come to order. We are meeting today to consider 3 pieces of legislation. All have been properly noticed and circulated, and there are copies available each side of the dais, along with copies of timely filed amendments. Amendments filed after the deadline have been circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, other members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. The item for consideration is H.R. 934, offered by Representative Bobby Scott. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I will now recognize Representative Cartwright to speak to that legislation. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 934, the Health Benefits for Minors Act, and H.R. 935, the Minors Pension Protection Act, are critical, urgently needed bills that uphold a promise that the federal government and the coal industry made to American miners in 1946. After a nationwide strike for adequate compensation for their hard work, UMWA coal miners won the right to receive pensions and health benefits when they retired. This promise has been kept and reaffirmed over 70 years by every administration in Congress, Republican and Democrat. But right now, that promise is in danger. Mr. Chairman, over time, as America's energy mix has shifted away from coal toward cleaner alternatives, many coal companies have declared bankruptcy, and their current and former miners have been losing the security that they earned for a lifetime of hard and dangerous work. Across coal country, and particularly in my home state of Pennsylvania, more than 100,000 retired miners and their families are facing the loss of the benefits that they depend on. As more and more companies have declared bankruptcy over the past year, the situation has become increasingly dire. If the last remaining company paying into the health and pension funds declares bankruptcy, which appears likely to happen soon, these benefit funds could collapse in a matter of months. Even in the best case scenario, the pension fund is projected to become insolvent by the year 2022, and some retired miners have already been notified that they will lose their health benefits at the end of this year. Congress has passed short-term fixes, but these are Band-Aids, and they've only extended the uncertainty that mining families have been dealing with for years and done nothing to solve the larger problem. Our retired miners deserve a permanent fix, and they deserve it now. H.R. 934 and 935 are straightforward, bipartisan bills that ensure the workers who have risked their lives to heat and light our homes continue to receive the benefits that they were promised. And beyond keeping our promise to our individual miners, we must ensure also a safe, healthy, and bright future for their whole communities. There's a lot of work to be done to clean up abandoned mines, for example. We have to reclaim these landscapes, clean up the air and water, and allow for new economic development that can replace lost mining jobs. Well, today, we can take an important step forward by passing H.R. 934 and 935 out of this committee and making sure the government keeps its promise to America's miners. And I know this committee will continue to work to advance legislation that will address the myriad of challenges facing our miners and their entire mining communities. So I thank the chairman for putting these bills on today's agenda, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. And before we consider amendment, does any other member wish to be recognized on the bill? If there's no further debate before we begin the amendment process, does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I just had an inquiry. Is the audio amplification system working in here? I can hardly hear anybody. Can we,
No.
we make adjustments?
Thank you. Does any member wish to offer an amendment to the legislation? If there are no amendments, the question is on adopting the bill and ordering favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Recognize the minority for the motion.
Mr. Bishop?
Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional or dissenting views on the bill just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
Without objection. The item now for consideration is H.R. 935, offered by Representative McKinley. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open it to amendment at any point. Does anybody, any member wish to speak on the legislation? I will recognize myself. These bipartisan bills are key to ensuring that hundreds of thousands of retired and sick miners are able to support their families and stay in their homes and pay their medical bills. The coal industry has been in decline for decades, and the impacts of that have been felt hardest by the people who can least afford it, the retired coal miner. More and more coal companies are declaring bankruptcy and walking away from their obligations to pay into the coal miner health and pension benefit funds. The coal industry is not coming back, and no matter how many regulations the president tries to roll back or how many golden parachutes coal company executives give themselves. But that doesn't mean we can break the promises we made to the miners who earned their retirement benefits through decades of hard work. H.R. 935 and the legislation that just passed, 934, would permanently protect these benefits. I strongly urge my colleagues to support these bills. And is there any further debate at this point before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Across this country, multi-employer pensions are on the brink of insolvency. In many cases, this is because of poor management and the lack of money being paid into the fund. Now, I'm sympathetic to the situation currently facing the miners' pension fund we are looking at today. The main reason why this fund is in the situation it finds itself is because of the disastrous war on the coal perpetrated by the Obama administration. The crippling of this industry by the Obama administration forced many companies that paid into the fund to go bankrupt and therefore not able to meet their pension obligations. I do not, however, believe that the American taxpayer should be left on the hook to pay for the sins of the previous administration. I instead want to work with my colleagues to ensure that we have a healthy coal industry so we can ensure that current and retired coal miners are protected and have secure futures. Hardly the government is a vestige of solvency. I want to bring up the OPT program, something that was never followed through by an act of Congress, in which employers were given a 15.5% discount in regards to hiring a foreign worker over and a domestic worker. What's so ironic about this is that 15.5% rebate is FICA, is your withholding tax. And yet these people will be able to get Social Security and Medicare without putting a drop in. That's how good the government is on programs. And once again, not even authorized by Congress. So government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And with that, I yield back.
Any further debate on before we begin the amendment process? If not, the First Amendment is offered by Representative Curtis, designated amendment number 30. Representative Curtis, you're recognized in support of your amendment. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment will simply bring this bill in line with the Senate version by adding a provision to help protect the remaining companies contributing to the UMWA pension plan. In 1984, over 2,800 employers were contributing to this plan. Today, that number is just 11. This amendment will protect the remaining contributing employers and therefore ensure they aren't accidentally put out of business by this bill. This includes putting unsustainable contribution increases on employers or being forced to pay billions of dollars to cover the plan's lack of funding. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Anyone wish to comment on the amendment that Mr. Curtis is sponsoring? Recognize myself. The amendment adds language from the Senate Companion Bill S671. I want to thank the sponsor for offering the amendment, which I understand is supported by the United Mine Workers of America, and I am prepared to accept the amendment. Mr. Curtis? Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Curtis Amendment number 30. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Any other amendments on the legislation? Hearing none. If there are no further amendments, and the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordered favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The item for consideration now is H.R. 2779, offered by myself. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize myself to speak on the legislation. I think today's markup on H.R. 2779 is long overdue. It's been too long, 12 years to the day, in fact, since the committee last marked up a hard rock reform bill. But that's nothing compared to the 147 years that we've been stuck with a law that cheats the American taxpayer, ignore the mining industry's devastating impacts on the environment, cultural heritage, and prioritizes hard rock mining over all other uses on public lands. For my entire life, I've lived in an area that has been treated by the mining industry as one of the chief sources of extraction and revenue. I've seen firsthand what mining does to our land. I've seen the way it pollutes water. I've seen how sacred sites and our more special natural places are treated as mere annoyances to be used and plowed over. For my entire life, I've seen the mining industry ignore concerns from tribes and local communities, and I have listened to the same industry scream bloody murder anytime anyone threatened to make them play by the same rules as other industries. The problem is, after nearly 147 years, the mining industry believes it is immune from paying its fair share, cleaning up its messes, or acting like a good neighbor. But while they enjoy the law that was passed in the days of robber barons and Reconstruction, the rest of the world has moved on, and it's that time they caught up. H.R. 2779, the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act, would permanently end the free-for-all that allows mining companies to purchase public land for only a few dollars an acre and instead establish a royalty on hard rock mining, similar to the royalties that oil, gas, and coal companies have paid for nearly 100 years. It would end an antiquated claim system that allows companies and speculators to freely tie up vast tracts of public land for virtually nothing. It would force the most polluting industry in America to finally pay to clean up its past messes. There are 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines across the country, many of which pose a significant threat to public health, safety, and the environment. The best estimates are that it will take roughly $50 billion to clean up these sites. $50 billion that right now would have to come out of the taxpayer's pocket. The bill changes that and establishing a new fund to clean up abandoned mine sites nationwide. The bill also recognizes that there are lands that are too sensitive, too special, or too valuable for recreation or scenic beauty to be handed over to the mining companies. These bills make these special passes off limits. Indigenous people in particular have been especially harmed by irresponsible mining practices. In my home state of Arizona, Pasquayaqui tribe, the Hopi tribe, the Tohono Nation have been fighting for over a decade to protect sacred sites from the proposed Rosemont mine. This is in part because federal land managers say that the 1872 mining law gives them no flexibility to say no to a mine or to require mining companies to improve their plans. The bill makes it clear that land managers can ensure that mining can only be done when it can be done right. Reforming our mining laws is long overdue, and I'm proud to be a sponsor of the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act of 2019. I urge my colleagues to join me in bringing American mining into this modern era, and I yield back the balance of my time. And before we consider any amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized on the bill? Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill we're considering today, the Hard Rock Leasing and Reclamation Act of 2019, is simply another attempt by my Democratic colleagues to further cripple our domestic mining industry. By imposing a grossly unrealistic royalty system on current and future mining operations, this bill makes domestic mining operations lose almost all viability. The fact that we are a nation are becoming more and more reliant on foreign countries, many of whom are hostile to the United States, i.e., let's bring up China. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. is currently 100% import reliant on 18 minerals and more than 50% reliant on another 30 minerals. This is completely unsustainable. This bill also puts at risk renewable energy technologies in the United States. Yes, it is. We are import reliant for 14 of the 15 minerals required in most renewable energy technologies, and demand will soon outpace supply. Proponents of this bill say the current mining law is antiquated and allows companies to mine anywhere they want without reimbursing the taxpayer. This could not be further from the truth. The general mining law has been amended several times to require increased environmental standards and establish greater fees for mining operations. In fact, in fiscal year 2017, the mining industry paid $65 million in mining claim fees and 40 to 50% of all earnings in taxes, fees, and state royalties. The proposal contained in this bill to change the current claim system to a leasing system would also be disastrous for domestic mining. A leasing system would leave domestic mining operations open to politicized permitting processes and allow mining leases to be canceled at a moment's notice for political purposes. This will stifle upfront investment in mining projects because of the increased uncertainty caused by the political leasing system. As the proponents of this bill know, without substantial upfront investment, mining projects are just not possible. It is clear what the true motive of my colleagues is with this bill: to put every mine in the United States out of business, therefore putting thousands of Americans out of work and leaving us further reliant on foreign countries for minerals that are critical to our economy and national security. Actions speak louder than words. The chairman of the committee, actions have actually shown his true intent. Let's take, for example, the Ironwood Monument. The Ironwood Monument was actually located further east, but it was extrapolated egregiously to incorporate a nickel and mining possibility. That's how obstinate the chairman particularly is of the mining industry. This isn't an attempt to reform and get more royalties. This is to kill the industry at point blank. Now with that, I've got a whole gaggle of letters I want to submit for the record. The Uranium Producers of America, American Exploration and Mining Association, Wyoming Mining Association, Utah Mining Association, New Mexico Mining Association, Nevada Mining Association, National Mining Association, the Montana Mining Association, the Idaho Mining Association, the Colorado Mining Association, the Arizona Mining Association, the Alaska Mining Association. Almost every western state is associated here. I want those submitted for the record. It's sad that we actually see very little understanding of what hard rock mining actually is all about. The royalty system, the compensation, and we see criticism from the other side about multinationals now working on the only mines that we have in this country. Think about it. We've put our mining associations here in this country out of business because in order to actually make a payroll, you have to have investments over across the seas. There's a right way to do it, but the minority or the majority always pretends that every mining site is something that's going to be abandoned. I got to show you, the technology today is amazing about how you can never even find where they actually mined. Technology rules, and that we should be looking at that. We shouldn't be actually looking at something in a knee-jerk reaction. We ought to be importing and trying to structurally make it so that it's much more affordable to actually mine in this country and not be reliant on a foreign country like China. With that, I yield back.
Is there any further debate on the legislation before we go into the amendment process?
Sir.
Mr. Bishop.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't say anything about the first two bills that we had simply because I think they are good bills in a difficult situation that have been worked out in a bipartisan way. What Mr. Gosar said about the second bill, though, was accurate. If you really want to solve the problem, quit destroying the industry at the same time. I'm going to speak against this particular bill because this is to all the vast number of our committee who are here to listen to this debate, because this is a messaging bill. This is a bill that's not going to be signed by the president. It's not going to be even heard in the Senate. It's going nowhere at all. It's a messaging bill. And messaging bills, whether they're presented by our side or the Democrat side, are dumb. This is for special interest groups who are dumb. The very concept behind it is dumb. Look, in our world, we need critical minerals more than ever before. Everything from modern weapon systems to smartphones to electric vehicles. And yet, the very basis of this bill is to disrupt the underpinning of our domestic hard rock industry to make it more difficult. In fact, the end result will be to drive these industries out of the country, these mineral mining elements out of the country. We are already facing a global shortage of cobalt, which is one of 4 major minerals that are necessary for electric vehicles. Tellurium is required for solar panels, and it's 8 times rarer than gold. In fact, according to the World Book, copper is going to play a vital role in renewable energy markets in the future. We will need as much copper in the next 25 years as we've needed in the last 5,000 years, and that tellurium that's needed for solar panels, that's all coming from copper refining, which is found abundantly in my state, in the chairman's state, everywhere from Arizona and Utah all the way to Minnesota, and does nobody any good if it's stuck in the ground. And that's the net result that would take place if this bill were to be enacted into law, which it never will be. In fact, if this bill were enacted into law, it would probably help us because we wouldn't have had to have this markup at all, because the first 2 bills would have been useless because there will never be any miners to need pensions in the future. So I'm opposed to this simply because this is a messaging bill that's going nowhere, has no impact, and actually would be detrimental to the entire element and what we need. If somebody was, in my estimation, dumb enough to sign on to the Green New Deal, you would be dumb to actually support this position, because what you need to implement the Green New Deal is the critical minerals that would be prohibited, or would be stopped, would be driven from this country by this bill. Now, there probably would be mining going on. It just wouldn't be in America. It'd be overseas. And that's wrong. That's just simply dumb. So this is a message bill for certain special interest groups. Good, you got it. I'm happy with the message. But it's poor policy. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to, Mr. Graves?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chairman, you brought up in your opening statement that you believe that this is a public resource, that it has value, and that therefore you think that the public should be able to gain or ascertain some public value from this resource. I've made that same argument in this committee dozens of times, particularly on red snapper. We have a public asset that is very much demanded by the public, and this committee has repeatedly opposed efforts to assign a value. I've tried to do this very thing and recognizing and pointing out to this committee that we're taking something that has extraordinary demand and we're just giving away for free. People often say we should run government like a business. Well, I don't understand how taking this fishery and just giving it away is running government like a business, giving away for commercial opportunities. Mr. Chairman, I think that the ranking member and Mr. Gosar made really good points when they talked about how the first two bills are largely designed to bail out the workers that have had adverse implications because of the policies that have undermined the mining industry writ large. And I think that we've got to be very careful about how to assign value to these public resources because it could further undermine or exacerbate those job losses and the implications on that industry. I think that Mr. Gosar has two amendments that are very thoughtful in ensuring that we don't undermine U.S. economy, U.S. strategic interest, the U.S. national security, and I think that those are things that they shouldn't be partisan, Mr. Chairman. I don't think they should. I think these should be bipartisan issues that we should all be concerned about. When you had a hearing on this bill, I told you that. I said, look, I think that we should assign value to public resources. I do have concerns about your non-competitive lease rate in the bill of 12.5%. I asked then where it came from, and I don't know that there was a very good answer there. I think that that we ought to be very careful about just pulling numbers out of the air and assigning them to any type of lease. That's not market-based. I understand if it's non-competitive, we need to determine what the right rate is, but I don't know that just making a number up is the right path. There are a number of other provisions in here that do cause significant concern, but I just want to highlight, I think that it's really important, as Mr. Gosar and the ranking member noted in the opening statements, we've got to be careful about further damaging an industry that the first two bills were designed to try to some degree, bail out because of previous policies that injured the industry. And so as we move forward, I urge that we be very thoughtful of that. I do have a few amendments that I look forward to discussing that point out, I think, some of the concerns that we have. Yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to comment on the legislation itself? Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield my time to Mr. Gosar.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, to the gentleman from Louisiana, and to the chairman of this committee. I mean, when you look at some of the newer mines, let's take Resolution Copper, for example, and talking about the abandoned mine aspect. Here we got a company that does its due diligence and spends almost $1 billion, nearly $1 billion reclaiming a mine site, setting a standard that's impeccable. Impeccable. That's what we're not looking at, is looking outside the box in regards to how we can maintain and mitigate this aspect. So let's not feign that the industry is problematic with just this abandonment. It gets back to the aspect of business. Not taking those arbitrary lines, but didactically looking at a business, which government is horrible at. Government's horrible about that aspect. They can't balance their own pocketbook. This year we're over $1 trillion in deficit spending. Once again, I want to reiterate, government isn't the answer. It's the problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to comment on the legislation? Before we go to the amendment process, Without objection, the NS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The First Amendment is offered by Representative Gosar, designated number 7. Mr. Gosar, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a straightforward amendment that states that no royalty shall be imposed if the Secretary of Interior, in consultation with other federal entities, determine that imposing such royalties will have a negative effect on our national economy or our national security. Mr. Chairman, hard rock minerals are required to build things such as missiles and the modern weapon systems we rely on to keep our country safe, not to mention new technology like a cell phone, green new ideas for energy and consumers. If this bill is passed as is, as I stated previously, our domestic mining industry will be destroyed. This will lead us to being even more reliant on countries like Russia and China to supply materials needed for our national security. The lack of a secure and reliable supply chain that being exclusively reliant on foreign nations for these minerals will make manufacturing materials necessary for our national security more difficult. Take, for example, Elon Musk in regards to battery storage. Isn't it interesting that we moved all the way to China because we didn't have an adequate supply chain? The domestic mining industry also employs thousands of direct employees and thousands more indirect employees. This bill, as currently written, stands to eliminate their jobs and livelihoods. Instead of rushing headlong into remaking the whole system by which the domestic mining industry operates, we should allow federal agencies to determine what the true impacts of this legislation would be on the long-term national security of our country. This amendment would not kill this legislation. Instead, it would ensure that the legislation is properly vetted to take into account its risks to our economic and national security. I say to my colleagues, let's slow down this process. Let's make sure that we're not putting our country at risk and the livelihoods of hundreds of our constituents and thousands more people across the country at risk by decimating domestic mining operations. Arizona is known as the 5 Cs, and one of those 5 Cs is copper. It represents mining. That's very important to the future of this country. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment, and I yield back.
I recognize myself. I cannot support the gentleman's amendment because it does not improve the bill, nor the economic and national security of the United States. The amendment leaves complete discretion up to the Secretary of Interior to undermine one of the key components of the bill, which is requiring the hard rock industry to pay a royalty to the American people for the extraction of public resources, just like gas, oil, and coal companies do. If we can fight and win wars with oil companies paying royalties, a royalty on hard rock minerals is not a problem. Meanwhile, mining companies have been allowed to dig up, sell hundreds of billions of dollars in public minerals for a century and a half without paying any royalties. The mining industry says it's unfair to make them pay royalties. The real unfairness is to ask the American people to foot the bill for cleaning up mines while companies send most of their profits overseas. Finally, the bill also already authorizes reduced royalty for minerals determined to be strategic and critical by the Secretary of Energy. That is already in the legislation. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back. And anyone else wish to comment on the amendment?
I do.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Gosar, I appreciate the amendment. I found it interesting. I also agree with the content of it. I understand there's only 9 of the 46 members here that's going to hear the debate, so I don't know why we're doing it, but I was listening. So this is my question to you, if you will yield.
Yeah.
If Arizona has 5 Cs, what are they?
Well, we're known for our climate, we're known for our cattle, we're known for our citrus, and we're known for our cattle, citrus, climate, copper, climate, cattle, cotton, and citrus.
And citrus,
Yeah,
all
sorry.
right.
Had to do it.
Thank you. Now, see, if,
And congeniality.
and what I am, thank you, Sandra Bullock. So what is so sad is, you know, there are 37 members of this committee that will never know that fact. because they weren't here to listen to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Any further debate on the question on the Gosar Amendment number 7? If not, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The next amendment, offered by Mr. Gosar, designated number 9. Mr. Gosar, you're recognized to support your amendment. I don't see anything on this.
I got it mixed up. No, I know, it's my talking points. Where'd you put it? You got it hidden. That's right. Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment states that this legislation cannot go into effect if the Secretary determines the act will result in increased imports of hard rock minerals from hostile countries like Russia and China. Leaving ourselves over-reliant on hostile countries like Russia and China puts our domestic energy supply as well as our defense capabilities in the hands of our enemies. We all saw what China did earlier this year, threatening to embargo rare earths. Becoming completely reliant on hostile nations for critical minerals makes supply chains to domestic energy producers and defense manufacturers unreliable. Instead of crushing our domestic mining industry, we should be focused on improving our domestic mineral production. The facts are that we have the most stringent environmental and mine safety standards in the world. That is not arguable. We can produce critical minerals essential to our national security without harming our environment. Mining and environmental stewardship are not mutually exclusive. This amendment would not kill the bill. It would simply ensure that we are not putting ourselves at risk of further foreign mineral dependency. I fear that this legislation, along with other legislation passed by this committee, this Congress, is sending a message to our enemies around the world that we're not serious about getting our domestic mineral security in order. If this committee continues and all assault on domestic mining continues, companies will close and hardworking Americans will lose their jobs. Our country is blessed with abundant mineral resources that can be tapped in an environmentally conscientious way. But we continue to put unnecessary obstacles that stifle production, like this bill. When you look at it, you look at uranium-1. You look at what ends up happening with dependence on foreign entities for uranium. You look at what China's threat is in regards to rare earths. You look at the One Belt, One Road initiative that actually extorts countries across this world for their resources. It's interesting, the new technology is almost completely dependent upon these rare and critical earth minerals. And yet, the other side wants us to continually be reliant victims of a system instead of being empowered to be creators like our Constitution enables. And with that, I ask all my colleagues to vote for this amendment, and I yield back.
On yields, anyone wish to any further discussion on Mr. Gosar's amendment? If not, let me recognize myself. This amendment completely ignores the reality of the global mineral market. Additionally, import dependence does not automatically equal a national security risk. Cesium, which is the United States imports 100% of it, a mineral used to improve the functioning of solar cells, but all of that mineral is imported from Canada. And as far as, at least this week, Canada continues to be a very valued ally of the United States and one of our closest allies. But more to the point, the amendment would be impossible to implement in practice, as it would require the Secretary of Interior to assess what countries have interest hostile to the United States. This is not a legitimate attempt to address a national security concern. Contrary, it's nothing but an attempt to kill a bill that would reform our already the very antiquated mining system. recalling at hearings when representatives of the mining industries were made the argument that we need this for national security to stockpile these minerals for the future. And my question was, would you agree to a prohibition that as a mining industry, you would not export any of these minerals since you're telling us there's such value to national security and to domestic use? And the answer was unanimously no. And so the issue is that they follow the market, but we're being asked in this amendment to essentially not do anything about an antiquated system that is more problem than good in terms of us being able to respond to situations not only domestically but internationally in the future, and I would urge a no vote on the amendment. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in your previous statement in response to the first GOSAR amendment, you indicated that you were opposed because the Secretary had unilateral decision-making authority. I just want to make note that someone has to make a decision. And as a result of the Chadha decision, that it can't come back to the Congress. You have to have a person make a decision at some point. And I think that both of these amendments make a tremendous amount of sense. I think that they're well thought out, and I think that the bill without these does have pretty fundamental flaws, and I yield my time to Mr. Gosar.
I thank the gentleman. An inquiry to the chair. Would the chair enter into a colloquy with me?
Of course.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Mountain Pass mine in California?
No.
Well, see, once again, we don't take into understanding about the business practices of foreign entities like China. So let's think about this. What transpired is the assault on these rare earths. These are so monopolized by China that what they did is they infiltrated the marketplace, over 90%. And what they did is they slowly extorted more and more and more. And all of a sudden, by the way, we have rare earths all the way through our country. Even in Arizona, I have a nodule on my desk that everybody has to look at. And what ended up happening is it got the interest of people to start mining here in California, in this country. Oh, and by the way, I want to reiterate, this country does it better by far than anyone else in the world. And if you want to start talking about global climate and pollution, you better have all of that here. But what ended up happening is they rose it to the point where people started investing in this mine. And guess what the Chinese did? The Chinese flooded the market, taking the investment down where they couldn't even do the mine again. They've repeated this over and over and over again. And what we've done is we rewarded foreign entities to actually follow through with this. We're currently doing that with uranium with Russia. You think that uranium one was a misnomer? 25% of our reserves owned by Russia. And then they said they were not going to go across international borders. Well, we were told lie after lie after lie. So once again, we don't understand. The majority does not understand the business dynamics of the mining industry. If they did, they would have accepted these two amendments and probably would have never submitted this bill for messaging. Once again, it's sad to see that, once again, we talk about the business model, and yet, particularly, the chairman understands none of that. So with that, I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment, and I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Since this was a discussion back and forth, I felt that I should say something. The only rare earth mine in the country that you mentioned reopened this year, I believe, as the market demand increased. And we're talking about market-driven demand and the supply that has to respond to that market demand. It reopened because there was a demand. I'm I'm not aware of the conspiracy, but I am aware that it reopened because there was a demand. I think that's reflective of the industry. And it's also, the advisory committee on mining that is supposed to tell President Trump what to do for the future is requiring a subsidy, that whatever they extract, regardless of whether it is necessary and vital to any interest, that we as a country must agree to a certain amount to purchase of that mineral in order to subsidize it. That committee in 30 days will make those recommendations in behest of the mining industry. So not only is this bill timely and appropriate, but it's the work of the House. And as the administration proceeds to make a sweetheart deal with the mining industry, we're trying to create some balance with this legislation to make sure that the public interest is protected as much as the private industry of the mining companies that, because of 1872 law, continue to dominate the decision-making on that end. All we are doing is creating balance. Mining is not being shut down. They're being brought into the 21st century to comply and to behave and to respond to these times, not those times. That's the part I know about mining that I think is relevant to the discussion today. With that, I yield back my chance to respond. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on Mr. Gosar's amendment number 9. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded
Mr.
vote.
Gosar has requested a recorded vote. The vote will be postponed pursuant to earlier announcement. The next amendment is offered by Representative Graves, designated number 1, revised to 2, and I think we need to Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes as the amendment is being distributed to the members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, amendment number 1, what it does is addresses, Mr. Chairman, we've talked about revenue sharing, and I've talked ad nauseam in this committee about the issue of the unfairness, the lack of equity between offshore energy revenues and onshore energy revenues. Under this bill, you're creating you're establishing a royalty and then sharing it with the local governments and state governments without any types of conditions. In the case of the very small percentage of offshore energy revenues that are shared, we've committed these dollars both in federal law and under our state constitution to invest it in resiliency projects to help improve the resiliency of our communities, to save future federal disaster funds. Yet in this case, under the bill, the funds are just being given to the states. There's an inequity right now for police officers, firefighters, and other teachers and other public servants, whereby their Social Security benefits and potentially those of their spouses are reduced as a result of a flawed policy dating back to the late 1970s and early 1980s called windfall elimination provision and government pension offset, where, let me say it again, public servants' retirement through Social Security is actually reduced. And so this gives an opportunity for these funds to be used to address that inequity where the public servants' retirement benefits or those of their spouses are cut, and ensuring that the funds are used for a good public purpose. With that, I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing, seeing no member wishing to be recognized, recognize myself. This amendment is completely irrelevant and has nothing to do with the subject matter of the legislation before us, and I would urge my colleague to oppose this amendment. Hearing no further debate, the question is on Graves' amendment number 1, revised 2. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The next amendment is offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 2. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we've discussed in this committee the lack of consistency in regard to policy. This bill is designed to establish a resource rent, recognizing that natural resources have value. That's the premise of the bill. I've made the same argument in regard to red snapper, absolutely in-demand fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. And this committee has chosen to repeatedly reject that and just give away a resource for free. I could cut and paste mining and insert red snapper into the very statements that you made about this legislation. And so what this would do is it would strike the 12.5% non-competitive leasing rate that is established in this bill, and it would instead insert no more than the price for Gulf red snapper individual fishing quota. Therefore, if you feel that that's the appropriate policy, then let's apply it to your legislation as well. I urge adoption of the amendment. I think it's consistent with policies that you've advocated in the past, and yield back.
Grave, gentleman yields. Anyone wish to be recognized on Mr. Graves' amendment? Recognize myself. Again, this amendment is irrelevant to the legislation. The last time I checked, the price of Gulf red snapper and individual fishing quota had nothing to do with the royalties on hard rock mining. If the future of red snapper mines, let me finish my comment, Mr. Graves, do not come into existence, I'd be happy to include them in the discussion at a future time. Until that time, I would urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop.
Yeah, I would take slight umbrage with the statement that was just made. Obviously, what appears on the surface to be two disparate issues can actually be done together, because that you are talking about the rates as how you establish those particular rates. But once again, as I'm saying, as I'm looking this as a messaging bill, it doesn't really matter because it's not going to be heard by anybody after this committee anyway. But in lieu of that, if the gentleman from Louisiana would like to actually implement why you decided to tie those with the red snapper again, I would yield my time, the remaining time, to him.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bishop. Mr. Chairman, you specifically cited other industries and how there are royalties charged in other industries. That's exactly what the point I'm trying to make, is that you indicated consistency, you indicated there's a value to the resource. I'm simply saying the same thing. And so I think that there is, that my comments are entirely in line with comments that you made in the opening statement and subsequently in regard to this legislation. So while I understand that first blush, looking at this and saying, well, what in the world are we talking about fisheries policy for? This is about natural resource rents and the inconsistency of this committee in regard to how we apply those and those policies. I'm simply trying to provide consistency. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Back. Any further discussion on Mr. Graves' amendment number 2? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Graves amendment number 2. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment will be offered by Representative Graves, designated as number 3, revised. And as we pass out the amendment, Representative Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my friend from Arizona just noted a few minutes ago that we have a $1 trillion deficit this year and $22, $23 trillion debt of this country. And here we are once again handing out money with no conditions whatsoever. Something that I've heard from the constituents that we represent are the extraordinary cost of health care as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Both premiums and deductibles have gone up. Both premiums and deductibles. Very different than the projections by the president at the time on what the outcomes of the Affordable Care Act would result in. And so rather than just taking funds and just giving them away without conditions, I think that we should provide an opportunity for this Congress to fulfill the very goals, objectives that were established when the Affordable Care Act was being debated. And so this would ensure that the revenue generated from the bill would be spent helping to reduce or offset those health care costs that have gone up as a result of the Affordable Care Act. And let me say it again. This is simply using the funds to bring health care costs in line with the very projections that were established by President Obama when the Affordable Care Act was being debated. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone wish to be recognized on Mr. Graves' amendment? I recognize myself. I think this amendment, Mr. Graves, simply repeats a standard Republican talking point about the Affordable Care Act, which ignores the fact that the rate of growth in health care costs has gone down since the Affordable Care Act was passed. No doubt jeopardized by the ongoing litigation by the Trump administration with regard to essential parts of the Affordable Care Act that is before the federal court. It also ignores the actual reasons for rising health care costs in the country, something that Democrats in Congress are actually trying to do something about. A bill to reform our mining laws is not the place to do that, however. I oppose the amendment and will ask my colleagues to vote against it. And with that, I yield back. Any further debate? Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, I don't think we're entitled to our own facts, because if I was right, President Obama said that prices would go down, and in fact, they went up over $2,000 on premiums, and co-pays went up. So I think we need to be careful about what we're telling the American public, because that's not what my constituents and the constituents around this country have seen. Those costs have gone up. So let's be careful about how we actually look at dynamics and numbers. But once again, this gets back to the majority doesn't understand business.
Anyone else wish to be recognized on Mr. Graves' amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on Graves' amendment number 3. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen have requested a recorded vote. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement.
Why don't you do it right now? We outnumber you.
Maybe born yesterday, Mr. Bishop. The next amendment is offered by Representative Graves. Mr. Graves, designate your amendment designated number 4.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment.
5 minutes.
I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would simply ensure that the funds that are being allocated to the state, the communities, would be spent on programs to sequester carbon through natural systems, and also on community resiliency projects. Now, Mr. Chairman, I understand that that you may be softening up to some of the great ideas that are coming out of our office, and that you may be willing to work with us on this amendment as we proceed to the floor. If that's the case, I'd be happy to withdraw this amendment and work with you moving forward.
The gentleman, would you recognize myself, Mr. Graves? I do appreciate the particular amendment from the gentleman from Louisiana. I support funding for both natural carbon sequestration projects and community resilience, and I'm not opposed to using some of the funds raised from this bill for those purposes. However, since having just received the language this morning, some concerns about the lack of definitions in the amendment, which makes it very vague as to what projects would receive funding and what wouldn't. So I'm more than willing to work with the sponsor on more specific language for a floor amendment that accomplishes his the objectives that you stated. If he's willing to withdraw, and you said you would, then I'd be glad to work with you.
Mr. Chairman, do you see anything in the amendment that would cause it to be ruled out of order in regard to the topic? I understand your concerns about the specificity, and I'm willing to withdraw, but any concerns about the germaneness of rule of it being in order?
The issue was not about germaneness. The issue was not having enough time to deal with definitions.
I understand, and I'm willing to withdraw. I just want to make sure that you don't see any, okay. Thank you. I understand there's no germaneness issues. With that, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw amendment number 4.
The gentleman withdraws. Thank you, Mr. Graves. And the next amendment offered by Representative Graves, designated number 5. Mr. Graves, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as Ranking Member Bishop and Mr. Gosar and others have, the points they've made during this hearing is that some of the policies that have been carried out over the last several years have actually injured or undermined the mining industry. They have caused people to lose their jobs. And as a matter of fact, the first 2 bills in here are largely issues addressing the injury to the mining industry and to those employees. Another impact as a result of people losing their jobs is increases in Medicaid costs, because folks have to get health care from the federal government. And so this recognizes that, and what it would do is it would use a portion of the funds that are generated from the royalty rates to cover those Medicaid costs and the beneficiaries' costs as a result of losing employment because of these very policies that are undermining the industry. Urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Any further discussion on the amendment? Any member wish to be recognized? Recognizing myself, this amendment is well appropriate under the rules of the committee. The amendment is completely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the subject matter that of the bill. And I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back my time. And with that, hearing no further debate, the question is on Graves' amendment number 5. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. Vote postponed pursuant to my prior announcement. The next amendment is offered by Ranking Member Bishop, designated number 6. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Pass it down. No. Thank you.
Sure they're coming.
Now that it's passed out, we can do it quickly because there's not very many of us here to receive it. This amendment simply delays the imposition of the royalty on hard rock minerals if that mineral can be used for battery storage for electric cars, to ensure that our nation has the ability to maintain a domestic supply chain of these valuable commodities. In my opening statement, when I said why I opposed the bill, obviously it would have the ability of destroying the domestic industry and taking it forcing it to go offshore. And indeed, if someone wants to use electric vehicles in the future, you've got to have these minerals to do it. And this says you're not going to put the royalties on it if it can be used for electric cars or if it can maintain a domestic industry that produces the minerals that are necessary to be used for electric cars. So what I'm simply saying is to vote against this amendment is to vote against the process of using electric cars in the future. It's pretty simple. Yield back.
Any further discussion, members? I recognize myself in opposition to the Ranking Member's amendment. The bill already includes royalty reduction provisions for minerals that are truly critical and strategic. But this amendment would allow practically any mineral to be mined royalty-free, completely defeating the purpose of the bill. Electric cars use copper, steel, aluminum, and countless other metals that would be exempt from the royalty simply because they're used in a car. The language is broad and continues the unfair windfall that hard rock mining have enjoyed for nearly a century and a half. With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Thank you. Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Bishop Amendment number 6. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it,
Mr. Chairman,
and the
yes, I'm going to ask for people to vote against electric cars.
And in the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
That was a roll call vote.
Thank you for clarifying that, sir. The vote will be postponed.
you don't like cars, fine.
Pursuant to my prior announcement. Are there any other amendments to the legislation? No further amendments. We'll, returning to H.R. 2579, the question is on the unfinished business, the amendments to the ANS, and we'll begin with amendment designated GOSAR number 7. A recorded vote being requested. Members should vote electronically. Has every member recorded their vote?
Give them some time. Give them some time.
Has every member voted?
One more.
Does any member wish to change their vote? If
Oh, Channing.
every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 13 and the nays are 19.
The noes have it, the amendment fails. Amendment designated GOSAR number 9. Members will record their votes. Voting is open. Squinting, what's the count? Has every member voted?
Mr. Brown.
If every member has voted, does any member wish to change their vote at this point? And if the member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 13, the nays are 20.
The noes have it, the amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 1. Voting is now,
Graves number 1 revised 2.
the amendment designated Graves number 1, revised 2. Whatever that means. The members will record their votes. Voting is open. I forgot to tell you, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 12 and the nays are 22.
The noes have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 3. Number 3 revised. The voting is now open. Members will record their votes. Has every member voted? Any member wish to change their vote? If every member has confirmed their vote, if every member has confirmed the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 12 and the nays are 21.
The noes have it. The amendment fails. The amendment designated Graves number 5. Members will record their vote. Voting is open. What am I doing now? Does any member want to change their vote? Has every member confirmed? The vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 11 and the nays are 20.
The noes have it. The amendment failed. And 2 present, right?
2 present.
The amendment designated Bishop number 6. Voting is now open.
Those red people that don't like electric cars.
You think Graves will be chairman or ranking member? Has every member voted? Not yet.
like cars. That's a good Michigan vote.
I hope every member has confirmed their vote. The vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 17.
The amendment fails. The question is now on the ANS to HR 2579. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. The question is on adopting HR 2579 as amended and order in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered
Recorded vote.
favor reported as amended.
Recorded vote.
The question,
Recorded
a
vote.
final, a recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their votes. That was too close, Sister. Bishop almost snuck one out. Has every member voted? Any member wish to change their vote? If every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed. And the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. All members will have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, minority, or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the legislation ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent that for any bill ordered reported today with amendments, that the bill considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted by committee. Without objection, so ordered. Again, thank you very much. No further business. Meeting adjourned.